What are we doing here? I mean, why are we here? Maybe to be together. Maybe that's why we're here, to come together, to see friends, to connect with people, to connect in community, to be together is part of why we're here. Teaching is part of why we're here. Teaching, somebody stands up in the midst of the people and shares a teaching. We don't want any trouble. That's part of why we're here, is we want to find a way to live so that we stay out of trouble. I remember in a prayer we share almost every week, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us. We want to stay on the straight and narrow and stay far from trouble. We come to embrace the tried and time-tested and honored traditions of the faith. And we embrace them and we sing them and we share them, and they make us feel at home and comfortable. And all those reasons are reasons why people gathered in the synagogue in Jesus' day. They went to be together. Synagogue literally means to gather together. It is the gathering of the community, to synagogue, to come together. And that's why we're here, because we are coming together as those who share the journey of faith together. We come to hear a teaching, to hear the scriptures read and a reflection on the scriptures. The same was true in Jesus' day. We are here, as they were in Jesus' day, to share in the traditions of the community of faith. And we do that every week, and we try to do new things, but it's really hard to do new things because the tradition holds on to us and we hold on to it. And one of the things the church is famous for saying is, we've never done it that way before. And so we hang on to the way we've always done it, and those become the traditions of the faith, and we hand them down. And it was the same in Jesus' day. And we don't want any trouble. We want everyone to get along. We want to do things. If you were a Presbyterian growing up, you were taught to do things decently and in order. And that's the foundation of the theology of the Presbyterian Church, to do it decently and in order. We don't want any trouble. We want to think through these things. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, said we don't want enthusiasm. Enthusiasm leads us out of reasonableness, and we want to be reasonable. We don't want any trouble. And I think of the ruler in the synagogue who stood up when Jesus, as he's teaching, sees a woman and calls her over and heals her, and the ruler of the synagogue is indignant at what Jesus had done because he didn't want any trouble. There are certain ways to do things decently and in order, and what Jesus was doing was breaking the traditions and the order and the accepted way of living together in community. And I think of that ruler of the synagogue, and brings to mind people in my own history whose job it was to make sure that there was no trouble. In particular, the vice principal at my middle school. I remember the vice principal at my middle school, and I remember him well. I'm sure there was more than one occasion when he and I had a chat or two, and I thought of him and thought, that was his job, just making sure that there was no trouble. But then, remembering him, I thought of another guy who was even a greater influence on me. Mr. Curtis, his job was to make sure that there was no trouble. My first year in middle school, in middle school you go to lunch, and it's a big lunchroom, and there's chaos, and I guess the chaos had gotten out of control. And so they hired Mr. Curtis to come and stand in the lunchroom, by the lunchroom doors, and Mr. Curtis was this big guy. The only time you saw him was at lunch. And he was always in a suit, a dark suit and a tie. And he stood by the doors. There were like 6 or 8 doors that led into the lunchroom. And he stood by the doors. And you'd go up and you'd get your food. And Mr. Curtis had a big scar that went from below his ear down to the bottom of his chin. And word in the lunchroom was Mr. Curtis had just gotten out of prison. And there he stood by the lunchroom doors, keeping an eye on all of us so that there was no trouble. And I'll tell you what, when Mr. Curtis was in the lunchroom, there was no trouble. Everything was done decently and in order. And I think of the leader of the synagogue, the ruler of the synagogue, trying to keep things together. But Jesus shows up in the synagogue, and what Jesus does is he stirs up trouble, but it's the good kind of trouble. It's the celebratory kind of trouble, the thing that's unexpected, that you're not there for this. You're there for being together with people. You're there for the teaching. You're there for the traditions. You're there to stay on the straight and narrow and to stay far away from trouble. And what Jesus brings is transformation. Jesus brings transformation, and who is here for transformation? Who is here to have their life transformed by the power of the living God? Well, I don't know that anyone's ready for that. But whether we're ready for it or not, that's why Jesus is here. Jesus is here to bring the transformation of God into our lives. And it happens, just as it happened that day in the synagogue. When Jesus stood up teaching, the people had come together, and he hadn't come to keep them from trouble. He had come to bring the transformation of God into their life, into their real life. And I love how Luke tells the story. Jesus is in the synagogue teaching on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman. It's like she suddenly appears. And then we hear about what it is that she's dealing with. This affliction that for 18 years has held her captive. And when Luke describes the affliction that she's dealing with, a curvature of the spine, maybe through genetics or maybe through an injury, we don't know. But we've seen people like that, and as we go about our lives and we see them and they're bent over and bent over and bent over and they can't straighten up. They are powerless to straighten themselves up. And we see people like that and they get along. And somehow she made it to be in community for worship. Afflicted for 18 years, and you think about this. 18 years earlier, Jesus would have been about 12. You remember that story of Jesus when his parents take him to Jerusalem when he's 12 years old, and they leave the city thinking that he's with the family, only they've forgotten him. And Mary and Joseph are talking, "Where's Jesus? Where's Jesus?" They can't find him. They go back, and there he is in the temple speaking to the elders. And he said, "You should have known I would have be in my Father's house." Jesus was 12 years old then. And then for the next 18 years, he grew up. And it says in Luke's gospel, he grew in wisdom and in stature and in the favor of God and others. He grew in wisdom and in stature. So as Jesus is growing in wisdom and in stature, this woman is being afflicted with something that is keeping her held captive. She's unable to stand up straight. Her stature is diminishing. And she and Jesus meet in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And Jesus transforms her life. The first thing he does is shares the Sabbath of God with her, and that becomes a big issue. This is the Sabbath, and Jesus is saying, I know it's a Sabbath. I'm doing the Sabbath. Because what the Sabbath had come to mean was it's a day that you don't do any work. And the Sabbath was a day to be observed. But before the Sabbath was a day to be observed, the Sabbath was an experience to be entered into. It was the experience of what God did after creation was over. And do you know what God did after creation was complete? God saw it. And God saw that it was very good. And therefore, on the seventh day, God blessed the day and hallowed it. So it is a day to be seen through the eyes of God and to experience the blessing of God. That's Sabbath. Before Sabbath is a day to be observed and to follow in obedience. Sabbath is an experience of God to be entered into. And the experience of God is to be seen. God sees all of creation, and behold, it's very good. And Jesus looks over and sees this woman. And that's why it's so important for us to see one another. It is a part of the blessing of God. And some people say, oh, I went to a church and nobody talked to me. It's like nobody even saw me. But the experience of Sabbath is to be seen, and Jesus saw her. And I don't think she was trying to make herself visible. I think Jesus looked with the eyes of God and saw her. And then he spoke to her. Woman, you have been freed from your affliction. And it's amazing because God sees creation and God speaks and says, it's very good. Behold, it's very good. And behold, woman, you have been free from your affliction. And that's an experience of Sabbath. To hear the voice of God and to have God shape our life. To be seen by God, to have God speak to us, to have God shape our life. That is the experience of Sabbath, and that's why we come here. That's why we're here. Sabbath isn't a day to be observed. It is an experience to be entered into. We don't celebrate Sabbath on Saturday. We celebrate it on Sunday, which isn't the seventh day or the first day. It's the eighth day. Resurrection Day, the new creation. And we are participating in the new creation of God through the resurrection of Jesus. And so we come together, and why we're here is to experience Sabbath. To be seen by God and to hear God speak to us and to have God shape our life. That's Sabbath. And we are here to be lifted up into the story of God. What's your story? If someone said, tell me your story, what would your story be? Where you were born? Maybe where your ancestors came from, how you got to where you are, and some of the things that happened along the way, and what you think lies ahead. Is that your story? Because Jesus says our story is bigger than that. Our story is a faith story, and our faith story reaches all the way back to Abraham. Do you know that you are related to Abraham, and Abraham is a part of your story? And in Luke's gospel, Luke makes it clear that Abraham is a part of our story because God called Abraham, God had mercy on Abraham, God blessed Abraham, and Abraham followed by faith. This daughter of Abraham should be healed on the Sabbath day because it is a blessing of God. And we're children of Abraham. We are children of faith. And Luke's gospel is filled with references to Abraham. You remember when Mary gets news that she's going to have a baby, and she sings a song, and she sings about how God has fulfilled his promises and brought mercy and blessing into the world as he had promised Abraham. And Zechariah sings when John the Baptist is going to be born, and he sings about how the power of God has broken forth into the world, just as God promised to our ancestors and to Abraham. And Abraham keeps showing up, and here This woman who is healed is recognized as a daughter of Abraham. She is a child of faith. And did she do anything to get healed? Did Jesus say, your faith has saved you? Did she say, Lord, heal me? No. It was all grace. It was all a gift. And that is the blessing of God for us. That is our story. We have received the blessing of God as a gift. And we are a part of the story of God throughout the whole earth. And everyone who has shared in the blessing of God as a gift is a part of that story. So how has God blessed you? If you were to tell your story, where would the blessing of God come in? Well, this woman who made her way to synagogue on the Sabbath, she had a story to tell. I walked in there and I wasn't able to stand up straight, and God transformed my life. That was her story. And it is a long story of the power of God transforming lives, and God continues to do it. And that's why we're here. Because our story is a part of that story. And God is not finished bringing blessing and mercy and transformation into our lives. And so we're here for Sabbath, and we're here because the story of God is our story. And we are here because the salvation of God has come to us. So when have you celebrated the power of God in your life that has shaped your life and set you free, or given you a sense of the way forward, or helped you find your path, helped you believe, helped you lean in to the reality of the presence and the power of God? When has that happened in your life? Being a part of the salvation of God that's come into the world, it happens. It happens more than we often give God credit for. Over and over and over again it happens. We feel like we're alone, and suddenly we realize that God is with us. You're not here, and suddenly you know God's there. You listen in the quiet and you hear the voice of God giving you a sense of direction. Somewhere in the music that's lifting you up, that you're a part of, you get a sense that this dance is going to go on and on and on and never end. The salvation of God has come to us. And therefore, the celebration of God is what we share. That's why we're here, to celebrate the Sabbath of God and the story of God and the salvation of God, and to praise God with celebration for what God has done in our lives. That's why we're here. Transformed lives. And it happens. And to live in the celebration and to share the celebration and that truth of a transformed life, that is such an amazing opportunity. And the woman who was healed that day, whose life was transformed, she stood up and she was praising. And everyone who was gathered together, they stood up and they were praising. Everyone was praising. I think the assistant principal and Mr. Curtis and the leader of the synagogue, they were all praising in the end. Such is the power of God. An amazing thing happens when we come together. And then we go and live it in the world. To live the Sabbath of God, to be seen and to hear God speak to us and shape our lives, to share in the story of God and the salvation of God and the celebration of God, and to make that our living witness and our living testimony. And there's no greater thing than to share that experience with someone else. And sometimes we miss the opportunity. I was thinking about that all week. God gave me a great opportunity and I missed it. When we were on vacation, Diana and I, we went down to visit her folks in beautiful Southwest Florida and happened upon a little restaurant that served lobster rolls. Fabulous lobster rolls. I'd make the drive now for a lobster roll, but it's a bit of a hike. Incredible lobster rolls. We went in there and a young man served us, a young Indian man, and he was telling us about the community there and that we could get a Connecticut lobster roll or a Maine lobster roll. And we said, well, we've lived in both of those places. And they were wonderful places. So we've had Connecticut lobster rolls in Connecticut. We've had Maine lobster rolls in Maine. And now here we are in Florida, and what's it going to be? So we had decisions to make. We had wonderful lobster rolls, great food. He came over and chatted with us, telling us about why he was there, how he got to be there and running this little restaurant. And then he said, well, I'll tell you one thing about the community of Southwest Florida. You are always going to meet someone older than you and richer than you. And we smiled and laughed, and I nodded my head. But I've been thinking, ever since we had that lunch, I need to go back and talk to that young man. Older than me, yeah, probably. But richer? I know Jesus. I know the Sabbath of God. I experience it. I live in it. The story of my life is a part of the story of God. And it's an amazing story and an incredible adventure with blessing and blessing and blessing beyond anything I could have ever imagined. I have been caught up in the salvation of God and celebrate that every week and try to celebrate it every day. Older than me? Yeah. Richer than me? I don't think so. I know Jesus. And he has come and transformed my life. And that's why we're here. Because he'll transform your life too. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.